strategic bombing raids, sinking supply ships, millions of refugees, and railway timetables all served to turn the war into a vast planning exercise for generals and governments. The conflict had become worldwide. Germany lost colonies, and Allied colonial troops poured into Europe. The British Navy blockaded German ports. The Germans practiced unrestricted submarine warfare, and any and all ships were targets. Even in Europe, the conflict grew, with Italy joining the war in May, and tens of thousands of Australian and New Zealander troops joining the fight at Gallipoli, while the much-hoped-for Allied breakthrough never came. Here's how the last 6 months looked so far in a little more detail. In early February, Turkish forces under German command launched a disastrous attempt across the Sinai Desert to take the Suez Canal. If successful, this would have crippled British supply and troop lines, but Indian and Egyptian forces crushed the attackers. On February 16th, on the Western Front, the French launched their second Champagne offensive. Hampered by the weather and a lack of artillery, they break off the offensive after a month, having taken 240,000 casualties. In the east, the Germans defeat the Russians at the Masurian Lakes and push them eastward into the Augustau forest, where they are decimated. But one Russian corps manages to hold on long enough to prevent an invasion of Russia. Further south, the Austro-Hungarian army launches a second winter offensive in the Carpathian Mountains against the Russians. Like the first, it is a spectacular failure. There were two more sinister developments also in February. The Germans began unrestricted submarine warfare. Within 6 months, Allied shipping losses would exceed the amount of ships being built. And in eastern Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks begin the forced deportation of Armenians. Over the next 2 years, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians will die in the Armenian genocide. As March rolled in, the British Navy imposed a total sea blockade on Germany. On the 10th, the British tried new tactics at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle and break the German lines, but thanks to poor communications, cannot take advantage of the break. The offensive is suspended after 3 days with large losses on both sides. Austria-Hungary tries and fails a third time to push the Russians out of the Carpathians. Not only that, but after months of siege, the Russians finally take the fortress of Przemysl, a national symbol of Austrian pride. The Russians threaten to break through the mountains and overrun the Hungarian plains. Only timely German intervention at Easter prevents this from happening. In April, British troops in Mesopotamia successfully defend Basra and then advance up the Tigris Valley towards Baghdad. In the west, the Germans launch their first offensive there this year as the Second Battle of Ypres begins April 22nd. As they begin the attack, they release poison gas with devastating consequences. But their own hesitation to march into the gas, the lack of reserves, prevents them from exploiting their success. Canadian troops show their remarkable skills for the first time. The battle lasts for a month and leaves Ypres still in Allied hands, but nearly surrounded, and costs the Allies 58,000 casualties, with the Germans taking 38,000. Colonial troops really see action in April. On the 25th, Allied troops land at Gallipoli to try to reach Constantinople, break through to the Black Sea, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The 70,000 landing troops include 15,000 Australians and New Zealanders, and within weeks, the attack degenerates into trench warfare, as the Turks prove too tough to handle. At the beginning of May, a combined Austro-German offensive begins in Galicia, called the Gorlice-Tarnów Offensive. Its enormous artillery barrages crush Russian defenses, and within weeks, the Russians have lost all the ground they'd taken since the fall of 1914. On May 7th, a German U-boat sinks the passenger liner Lusitania, drowning over 1,200 people, including over 120 Americans, and convincing many in America that they too must go to war. The British and French launched their first combined offensive of the year on the 9th in Artois. This offensive would last for over a month, and though the French were close to achieving their objectives several times, the offensive would end with 100,000 French casualties versus just 60,000 for the Germans. On May 23rd, Italy enters the war with the Allies and immediately begins offensives against Austria-Hungary. The first aerial bombing of London by Zeppelin happens the next week, killing 28 civilians. As June rolls around, the Austro-German Colossus continues to smash the Russian lines. Russian casualties for the offensive pass 400,000. The stalemate continues at Gallipoli, though the Allies try again and again and again to push back the Turks. On the Italian front, the first battle of the Isonzo River sees initial Italian gains soon repulsed with heavy casualties, establishing a pattern that would continue throughout the summer. In early July, Germany lost a major colony as German Southwest Africa fell to South African troops after 11 months of fighting. And on the Eastern Front, the Russians grow weaker and weaker as yet more German and Austrian offensives begin, this time threatening to take Warsaw in the center and Riga in the north. But the war wasn't just confined to land. There were also developments at sea. In January, British intelligence learned of a German naval raid on the fishing fleet at Dogger Bank and managed to foil it. The British also mined large tracts of the North Sea and stopped neutral vessels. And though their blockade of German ports was successful, the toll Allied shipping took from submarines was frightening. The war also evermore took to the skies as all sides developed aerial reconnaissance and mapping. The Allies had the aerial advantage until Dutchman Anthony Fokker developed interrupter gear for the Germans. This allowed German planes to fire machine guns through their propellers and aim the gun by aiming the plane, giving Germany control of the skies and beginning the age of the flying ace. So that, in a very small nutshell, was what had happened in the past 6 months. But what changes there were? 6 months ago, Russia was destroying both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian armies. Now, Russia was on its last legs, fighting on its own territory against pounding artillery it couldn't hope to match. The Allies had been optimistic, but had by now completely failed at Gallipoli, taken far more casualties than the enemy on the Western Front, and were in many ways at the Germans' mercy in the skies and on the sea. And yet, though Germany and Austria-Hungary were in the ascendant and making gain after gain, they were doing so at a terrible cost in men, and they would not be able to absorb such losses forever. Innovations came again and again to try and gain a decisive advantage. The flamethrower, poison gas, more and more artillery, but none of it was yet enough. Not to win, it was only enough to prolong the war and ensure that millions of men would die in the worst ways possible. So, 1 year of this war, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas. What do you think? Do you think it could have somehow been prevented, or is there some sort of way for a peace now instead of just endlessly continuing the war? Let me know in the comments section below, and if you never got around to checking our recap of the first 6 months of the war, you can do that right here. For more background information, check out our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. See you next time. Hi. As most of you know from watching the show, I live in Stockholm, but we shoot the Great War in Berlin. And I'm here this week in Berlin to shoot a bunch of episodes, and we thought we'd give you a behind-the-scenes look at how the Great War is made. Now, this room, there's a whole bunch of extras that paid loads and loads of money to work, right? Actually, they're not extras. These are people that work for, that was very good. These are people that work for Mediacraft, which is the YouTube network that finances our show. Now come here and you can meet some of our crew. Now this is a t-shirt that I like a lot. It says, I got 99 problems. No, wait, I mean cats. I got 99 cats. I don't actually have 99 cats. I do have several cats. They're all outdoor cats. Oh, these are a pair of Doc Martens that I just recently got that I like. I love Doc Martens. Now we're coming to a mirror so that Marcus can show you who he is, and he can say, hey.
Hey, what's up?
There's Marcus. All right. This war, which was supposed to be over by last Christmas, celebrates its first birthday this week. In just 12 months, we've seen the advent of weapons of horror like the flamethrower and poison gas. We've seen submarines intentionally torpedo civilians, and we've seen new fronts spring up pretty much every month. And now it seems the people at home have had enough, for there were stirrings of revolution in the air. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week in Poland, the Germans beat back the Russians on two sides of Warsaw, and the Great Russian Retreat, both there and between the Bug and Vistula rivers, had led to a scorched earth policy that would create millions of refugees. The Western Front was static. The Italians tried again and failed to break through the Austrian lines at the Isonzo River, and at Gallipoli, disease was becoming a major issue. Something that also happened last week, but was happening every week, was the ongoing Armenian genocide in eastern Anatolia. Now, on the 27th, the Ottoman Imperial Army forced the Russians back near Mush. But Mush had been in the headlines all month, since throughout the month, thousands of Armenians had been massacred in the region. But though news of these massacres caused great indignation among the Allies, it was becoming obvious by now that all restraints were easing on all sides. For Britain was preparing to use poison gas in its next offensive. and the Kaiser took back his earlier orders not to bomb residential areas of London. As impossible as it seems, the war was getting even uglier. Look at what was happening on the Western Front this week, and you'll see it even more. One of the micro battles that basically happened every day on the stalemate of the Western Front was this week at Hooge. This was a battle for a mine crater, which had been created during an earlier British assault on the German trenches. Now, mine craters were big prizes because they gave shelter to whoever captured them, and a pretty well-protected place from which to fire on the enemy. The attack began on the 29th, and the Germans used their heavy mortar shells, the Minenwerfer, later known as the Minis by the British. These shells not only blew people to pieces, but the power of the explosions was so terrific that several men of the attacking battalion were sent back behind the lines in a state of gibbering helplessness. Well, that was on the 29th. On the 30th, the Germans used flamethrowers on the British. Way back in February, the Germans had experimented with flamethrowers in battle, though ineffectively. But at Hooge, the burning jets of gasoline were devastating. Lieutenant G.V. Carey wrote, "There was a sudden hissing sound, and a bright crimson glare over the crater turned the whole scene red. As I looked, I saw 3 or 4 jets of flame, like a line of powerful fire hoses, spraying fire instead of water, shoot across my fire trench. The men caught in the blast of the fire were never seen again." That was the morning attack. In the afternoon, the British attacked again, going over the top at 3 o'clock and being cut to pieces by the machine guns that they hadn't had time to locate. It was a complete agonizing failure, and all for a hole in the ground. But while the action in the west might be micro, it was certainly macro in the east. In fear of possible invasion, Russia evacuated the factories in both Riga and Warsaw on the 25th. On the 27th, Warsaw was attacked on 3 sides. On the 28th, the German army crossed the Vistula between Warsaw and Ivangorod. On the 29th, the Lublin-Keln railway, vital for the Russians, was finally cut by Austro-German forces. And on the 30th, the Russians fell back along the entire line as the evacuation of Warsaw continued and the Austro-Hungarian army occupied Lublin. The Russians had steadily been losing territory for 3 solid months since German General August von Mackensen kicked off the Gorlice-Tarnov offensive. And now that a second offensive was beginning far to the north, it seemed like it would only get worse. And just imagine the effect it had on the morale of the hopelessly outgunned and out-equipped soldiers. There were certainly those willing to step in and take advantage of the situation. This week, the Russian General Staff gave out to all Russian commanders a secret report about Bolshevik anti-war propaganda that was apparently being hidden in gifts sent from home. At this point, one Russian report says that superhuman efforts were required to keep the men in their trenches. And on the 30th, in Petrograd, General Poplivanov, the new Minister of War, warned that demoralization, surrender, and desertion are assuming huge proportions. Actually, on the 27th, James W. Gerard, the American ambassador in Berlin, told Washington that Germans were picking out the revolutionists and liberals from the many Russian prisoners of war, furnishing them with money and false passports and papers, and sending them back to Russia to stir up a revolution. But the idea of governmental change was not only Russian. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey had even said back on the 15th, "The continuation of the war must result in the overthrow of all existing forms of government." That's the Foreign Secretary saying that. And this week in Berlin, the New Fatherland League supported a declaration by 91 German intellectuals, including Albert Einstein, that pushed for a compromise peace with no annexed territories. When the League then did a mail-out of an anthology of statements by British pacifists like George Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell, the League's offices were raided and it was forced to cease all publications. Eventually, the League's existence was banned. But you could see the huge discontent that was spreading in the countries that had been at war the longest. This wasn't quite the case with Italy, though, who had only been at war for a couple of months and hadn't yet had time to suffer 1 million casualties or so. This week went well for the Italians as they advanced on the Lower Isonzo the 25th, occupied crests in the Julian Alps the 26th, captured the island of Pelagosa in the Adriatic that same day. At the end of the week, were making offensives in the Venetian Alps and Trentino. And in the Adriatic this week, the French destroyed an Austrian submarine supply station at Lagosta. It was an active week for subs. The American steamer Leelanau was torpedoed the 25th. This was a cargo ship, and there were fortunately no casualties, but on 30th, a Leyland liner Iberia was torpedoed and an American citizen was killed. But since it had disregarded an order to stop and had tried to escape, the American State Department said it would take no action. And here are a few notes to round out the week. On the 25th, South Africa officially annexed German Southwest Africa. That same day in the Middle East, Nasiriyah was shelled, attacked, and occupied by British forces under General Göring. And the following day, Najd, in northeastern Arabia, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, announced its independence from the Ottoman Empire and put the garrison there to flight. And at the end of the week, 45 French planes bombed Freiburg and Pfalzburg as the war in the air continues to grow. So that's what was happening. The Germans closing in on Warsaw and Ivangorod as the Russians evacuate. The British being stopped from taking a hole in the ground by flamethrowers and high explosives. The Italians on the move and revolution in the air. But it had to come to that, right? Dreams of revolution, especially for Russia, who had already had one revolution in the past decade. Think, if you were in that army, an educated officer, watching hundreds of thousands of your comrades throw themselves against Austrian and German artillery again and again, armed only with bayonets or clubs, the lucky ones having a rifle. And all for what? Why were you fighting the Germans again? Because a Serb shot an Austrian a year ago? Did that make any sense to you? Did you still support your government? Your absolute ruler who sent you to fight? More and more often, the answer was no, as despair grew and grew. The war was exactly a year old, with no end in sight. You were reduced to torching your own country just to survive, and all you had left were your dreams of a future where you finally had control of your own destiny. Happy birthday, Great War. If you're new to our show or want to catch up on the events of the past 12 months, you can watch our playlist of special recap episodes right here. Now, 12 months of the war, of course, means that our channel and our show also celebrate their birthday with this episode. We've come a long way, and we could not have done it without you all, so thank you very much for your ongoing support. You guys are an awesome community. I love the comments. As somebody wrote, this is the only channel on YouTube where the comments don't suck. And that might not be entirely true, but I love the comments from you guys. I love that we're making this fantastic interactive documentary, and I'm really looking forward to the next 12 months with you all. You guys want to come here and say thank you to everybody? Guys, long as we're doing this episode.
Thank you.
Okay, Tony, Flo, David, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Don't forget to subscribe and tell all your friends about us. We'll see you for a long time coming. All right, see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, I'm Andy Nidell, and I'm sitting here in the Chair of Wisdom for another exciting episode of Out of the Trenches, where I answer all of your questions about the First World War. Bill McFarland writes to us on Facebook, a couple of questions for a possible Out of the Trenches. I'm curious what role the fledgling Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, played in the Great War. Did founder Sir Baden-Powell, veteran of the Boer Wars, serve in the Great War? Powell retired from the Army in 1910, by which time he was, I think, in his 50s. You can look that up and check it out. He did offer his services to the War Office when the war broke out, but Lord Kitchener apparently didn't take him up, thinking that Powell served the country much better by running the Scouts instead of joining the Army. And this actually makes sense, because it's hard to realize today what a big figure Powell was at the time. Like, his book, Scouting for Boys, sold somewhere up to 150 million copies, making it one of the best-selling 4 or 5 books of the entire 20th century, like on a scale with the Lord of the Rings books. Scouts did a lot during the war, but it was on the home front. They sold war bonds, they grew food for soldiers in scout gardens, they distributed propaganda, they carried messages. Oh, they patrolled coastal areas, stuff like that. Actually, fun trivia. George Taylor was the only British Boy Scout to die in the war from enemy action. He was killed in a bombing raid on Scarborough. Larry Bundy Jr. says, was there any truth in the story that the Lusitania was secretly carrying American supplies for the British? From what I understand, the answer is yes. Now, I've dug around a little, and files released from the British National Archives under the 30-year rule show that when a group of divers were planning on going down to the ship in 1982, officials were worried the ship might literally blow up on them. And the Daily Mail reported in 2008 that divers found 4 million rounds of American-made Remington 303 bullets in the Lusitania's hold. Now, I'm not 100% convinced, since you'd think that this news would be a lot bigger if it was true. But still, Winston Churchill wrote in a private letter earlier in 1915, before the sinking, it is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope, especially, of embroiling the U.S. with Germany. Some of the survivors of the sinking actually reported seeing a second explosion go off, which I guess would have been munitions. But what do you guys think? I mean, a lot of you guys are very well informed about this kind of stuff, so let's hear it. Tell me in the comments if you think that Lusitania was carrying war munitions when it was sunk. As I am well aware from the comment section of our channel, you have a lot more questions. So, if you head over to Reddit right now, more specifically to the history subreddit, you'll see that me and Flo are answering questions in the infamous Ask Me Anything, or AMA style. And you should come on over, it's loads of fun. And you can find the link in the doobie-doo. And click here to see our episode about the sinking of the Lusitania. Don't forget to subscribe. See you Thursdays. The war is now 1 year old, and you know, if you watch this channel, that a lot of people have done a lot of stupid things so far, but a few of them really stand out, so I've made my own personal top 10 list. I know everybody and his brother does top 10 lists, but, you know, what the hell. This show lives 100 years in the past, so we'll just say we did it first. Okay, here we go. Top 11 stupidest moves of the war during its first year. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Yes, top 11. This list goes to 11. So much stupidity, it's hard to leave someone out. So without fanfare or further ado, I'll get right down to business. In early 1915, Ottoman troops under command of German Colonel Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein, great name, had a seemingly clever plan. They would cross the Sinai Desert and take the Suez Canal from the British. This would cripple Britain's troop and supply movements, but you need artillery and supplies to do it, and there were no roads. So you'd have to lug the artillery through the desert. Now, how do you do that? Haha! German engineers had secretly dug wells in advance so that the desert crossing could succeed. But when they attacked on February 3rd, they were mowed down by Indian machine gunners backed by Egyptian artillery. But how? How did the enemy know they were coming? Well, they forgot. This was not 1900, not 1905, not 1910. This was 1915. By 1915, the British had reconnaissance airplanes, so they knew exactly when and where the Ottomans were coming and inflicted 10 times the casualties they took, kept the canal in British hands for good. So, number 11, the Ottoman Empire, forget the airplane.